Timmins James Bay.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's a great honor, as always, to stand in this House representing the people of Timmins James Bay, and to be here in the House tonight as we from all parties attempt to pass legislation on what is coming close to the second anniversary of the pandemic. If someone had said to me in March 2020 that we would be in the House debating the need to get 10 days paid sick leave, or to have laws in place to stop the harassment and threats of medical professionals by people who are our neighbors, I would have said it was simply impossible. And I think what COVID has taught us, and COVID is a very hard teacher, but COVID has been very clear from the get-go. This is something bigger than something that was within our human imagination. A generation of ours has never seen anything like this. Madam Speaker, throughout COVID, I find myself going back to Albert Camus, The Plague. I've been reading it and rereading it. You know, he says, our townsfolk were like everybody else, wrapped up in themselves. They disbelieved in pestilences, because a pestilence isn't a thing made to man's measure. Therefore, we tell ourselves that pestilence is a mere bogey of the mind, a bad dream that will pass away. But it doesn't always pass away, and from one bad dream to another, it is the people who pass away, especially those who've taken no precautions. When we're talking about the need to have 10 days paid sick leave 2 years into a pandemic, I feel like we found ourselves in some kind of dark dystopian Groundhog Day. That what we're repeating again and again are the same mistakes and still having difficulty learning the lessons of a pandemic. Because the pandemic doesn't care whether we believe in it or not. The pandemic doesn't care if it's fair. And the pandemic certainly doesn't care about the short-term goals of various political leaders like Jason Kenney, who decided to announce that this last summer was going to be the greatest summer ever because he was simply going to ignore health protocols in order to make his party look good. And he plunged Alberta into medical chaos and caused the deaths of too many innocent people. I think of Doug Ford, who, as people were dying in the warehouses in Peel, Brampton, in the 401-905 area, he was not willing to put paid sick leave in. And in fact, he recently said he believed that, come January, there would be no need for vaccine mandates. A man who's still refusing to learn lessons. And we know here the culpability of the Canadian government in fighting at the WTO against the right of the Global South to create vaccines. Did anyone think that Omicron wouldn't happen? That we would allow ourselves first wave and second wave boosters, that we would protect ourselves, but we would not ensure adequate vaccination in other parts of the globe, and that suddenly, somehow, the pandemic wouldn't go there and come back. So now we're dealing with Omicron. I think that the line from Camus is that he says that we have learned that the pandemic has made us all share the same collective fate. It's a hard lesson we're learning. And I remember in the first wave how we were all rose up and how hopeful, and people took up hobbies and people were going to get themselves physically fit. And Camus says, at first, the fact of being cut off from the outside world was accepted with more or less good grace, much as people would have put up with any other temporary inconvenience and interrupted only a few of their habits. But now they had abruptly become aware that they were undergoing a sort of incarceration. And I think in the isolation and difficulties, the vast majority of people carried on. This morning when I walked through the snowstorms in Ottawa, I saw almost every single person wearing a mask. The vast majority of people have taken up what they know is going to be a difficult and maybe a long-term issue. And sure, they complain. They have a right to complain, but they carry on. We know in the first wave and second wave, the people who phoned our offices daily, that we tried to help them, to give them answers, to keep businesses going, people who had legitimate fears. Fears about the future of their business. Fears about health care. Fears about all the disinformation and falsehoods that were being fed, and those were all legitimate questions because we were dealing with something bigger than ourselves. But, Madam Speaker, I found by the fourth wave that things had shifted. They had shifted to a sullen tiredness on the vast majority of people, but in a small minority. They had gone to a different place. A kind of radicalized sense of self-isolation and self-entitlement. A belief that somehow the government and the medical institutions and their neighbors were all against their right to go and do what they'd always wanted to do, and they weren't doing their share, so the rest of the population were doing theirs. And then we started seeing these terrible images that somehow compared the mass murder of the Jewish families in Ukraine with the fact that Buddy couldn't go to Eastside Mario's because he refused to get a vaccine. And then they began to turn on frontline medical workers, talking to paramedics who said to me, "What is it about us?" Paramedics who are out there in the middle of the night on the highways at accidents, who are going in during the opioid deaths, who are on the front lines in the hospitals. Why are they being targeted? The fact that in my region, a doctor who was harassed and gave up her practice. There's something deeply wrong that we have to come here at this point. And there's something wrong in the fact that it's finally, after 2 years, we recognize the fundamental medical principle that if you are feeling sick, you shouldn't go to work. It is the most common sense way, but to stop the spread, particularly now of Omicron. But the fact that we have to have a law to protect workers from harassment is deeply concerning. And I will say that we will stand up for the medical workers and we will bring that law in. But in doing that, let us not forget and let us not diminish the fact that there is incredible fortitude among the Canadian people. I was very disheartened to hear my Conservative colleague talk about how we had to accommodate people who deny science, people who deny the need to have a collective responsibility for their neighbors, that we have to be accommodating them, as opposed to saying, no, we stand for the right of people to go to work and be safe. That when you go to work, you go to school, that you go to the hospital, that you can come home at the end of the day, even in these hard and uncertain times, because you know that your government is taking every step possible. So that is part of what we're here to do tonight. We need to address the need to change the trip waiver. Canada has to stop being a laggard on the international stage. It has to show leadership. We are, as Camus says, all collectively in the same boat when it comes to the pandemic. But, Madam Speaker, I would like to end quoting Camus again, because what isolation has taught me is the power of family, the power of community, and certainly for me, the power of live music, which I hope comes back. Because the people in the village that Camus writes about said they now know there is one thing that we can always yearn for and sometimes attain. It is human love. And he said that out of the plague that affected the people in his town, that he realized that there was so much more to admire in people than to despise. And finally, and I find this so powerful because I am so tired and disheartened and hurt by what COVID has done to the fabric of our communities and our sense of confidence and our ability to see each other. The Camus says that what's true of all the evils in the world is true of plague as well, because it helps people rise above themselves. I urge my colleagues, as we are in the fourth wave or the beginning of a fifth wave, I don't know how many waves, that we are not out of this. This pandemic is with us now, but we do not have to give into it. We do not have to give it into fear, and we do not have to give into stupidity. That there are smart ways. It's the only way that we can take on COVID and restore that sense of human community and that bond that keeps us together. So I urge my colleagues to support this legislation.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to thank and compliment my friend from